lovely having the opportunity of thinking back to my wonderful years at Sussex in its early years, just when it was the most creative, new university, the first of 7 new universities at a period in British history, generally, economically, intellectually, culturally, of real creativity. Before I get on to Sussex itself, ladies and gents, let me just say a few words about my own early life and how I got to be doing the kinds of things that we'll be talking about. There you have a picture of me. It's on the front cover of a book I recently wrote, Little Me on My Father's Shoulders During the War, because I was born in November 38, just under a year before war broke out. So my earliest memories are of the war, lovely mum and dad, very sweet to me. Dad would fight in the war, come home from time to time. And I didn't know anything about universities or anything. I grew up, went to a local school, went to a local secondary school, just an ordinary grammar school, had a brilliant history teacher, I might say, who even now, I'm talking to you and I'm nearly 84, he's just been 95. And I still like to see him and have a coffee with him and thank him for all he prepared. He was the one who helped prepare me to get into Cambridge. I got an open scholarship at Jesus College, Cambridge. I loved the university world. I loved that university world. I worked very, very hard, but I met some of the professors who were very generous and kind to me. And I thought, what a wonderful world to be part of, although, of course, it was very old-fashioned in its own particular way. So instead of staying on there and doing a PhD or anything, I decided, this is the height of the Cold War. I was at Cambridge 58 to 61. That was, year of crises in the Cold War, and so Kennedy was recently elected, and I wanted to go to America. So I was lucky enough to be able to go to a beautiful campus of Cornell University, upstate New York, brilliant faculty, not in history this time, but in political science. And I learned a great deal about the American political system, the history of the presidency. There was this handsome young historian, American Anglophile, new President Kennedy, and he became one of my heroes. I traveled around the country quite a bit, as you would. I found myself going through the Old South. This was the centenary of the Civil War, which in the Old South they called the War Between the States. And I saw the appalling racism during the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, something that's recurred in our own time, sadly, very sadly. And I found myself getting involved in civil rights activities, staying with a Black family and helping them to do voter registration, so many things that were to influence what I then went on later on to do at Sussex. I was a postgrad doing political science, not history, and the subject on which I specialized, the case study, was about American presidential decision making. And I thought the most dramatic presidential decision in my lifetime, probably, and throughout almost a great deal of history, was Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. I went to see him and ask him all about it in his library in Independence, Missouri in 1963. Well under 20 years since the atomic bomb had been dropped. And he completely undercut my whole thesis. He said, what's your name? You're from England, you're Dan. Well, Dan, you think the decision to drop the atomic bomb was the biggest presidential decision? It wasn't a decision at all. I had to do it, and no option whatsoever. And he laughed at me, he laughed with me, and I came away thinking, okay, don't rush to judgment about aspects of American political, social, economic, military history. Something I keep thinking about these days to this continual time. Anyway, everybody kept saying to me, Daniel, what are you going to do with these degrees you're getting? I said, I don't know. Jobs grew on trees in those days for a youngster this was the time of the 60s and expansion and the slightly younger generation than me making all the big decisions. And one day when I was in America, my dad sent me a letter which enclosed an ad saying from some British newspaper, the News Chronicle or something like that, there's a new university near Brighton, and they're looking for, bright young lecturers to apply, particularly in politics, history, etc. So I thought, well, what the hell? I wrote a letter in those days, way before emails or anything, to Professor Asa Briggs, the historian. Oh, yes, he'd written something about, I think, reviving Victorianism or something. And he wrote a very civil letter back. And yes, so you look something we might be interested in. Can you get some references? And I got references from Cornell. I got references from Cambridge. I was appointed an assistant lecturer. I was still 24, nearly 25. And I was appointed to Sussex. We're now in September 63, when I first went to see this new campus, not actually by now in Brighton, but nearby, between Brighton and Lewes, somewhere called Falmouth, which Asa Briggs had written about. And I was very excited to see it. My dad drove me up there, and the University of Sussex, I learnt to use that phrase. It sounded wrong. Should be University of Oxford or University of Cambridge or Harvard or Yale or something. Sussex, well, let's see what it's like. And it was wonderful. Many of these wonderful buildings were still being constructed when I went there. And in fact, the day that I arrived, this was in September 63, I think that's the library under construction on the left. And there's my dad. That's not me, it's my father, standing in front of what we presumed would be the main entrance. Now, the arts building was literally just being finished then. I wandered into what was to be called the arts building, so far as I remember, and up to where I was going to have an office. I presumed that it'd be my study. Academics don't have offices. Oh, yes, they do in America, so maybe we were getting all Americanized. And I took the plastic cover off what I thought of my table, but it was my desk, checked that the telephone would work, and even over the next week or two, met one or two of the people who are going to be my students. Myself, all dressed up, I'm still only just about 25 or something, but dressed up as though I were a senior academic with a young, I think he was a PhD student of mine, probably all of 3 years younger than me. Can't remember his name. But there you have an image of the times. And Sussex was very exciting. I loved being there. And very, very quickly, I kept getting, not emails, what would you call them? A memo from one of my senior research fellow colleagues, a whole series of memos that went identically to a whole lot of us saying, "Dear colleague," I'd never been thought of as a colleague before, "we'd be grateful if you come to this meeting or that meeting, sit on that board, prepare a prelim exam, grade some papers, etc., etc." And I suddenly found that I really had to do serious academic work. I was very young, and it's extremely embarrassing when all the really clever people who were about 5 years older than me would say, "Oh, hello, I'm Fred, Bill, Valerie, you're Daniel. Oh, how nice to meet you. What are you working on now?" And I thought, Christ, I'm not working on anything. I'm desperately trying to find my way. I've never done university lecturing before. I've got to teach seminars and tutorials. I've got to prepare a bibliography for this course, and so on. So I thought, well, in order to answer that, I better find something that I need to be doing. And before long, I found myself, sitting quietly in the library once it was open and preparing for this and that and the other. And at the same time, I can't emphasize sufficiently, this was I mean, in such contrast to our own times. I'm recording this at a difficult time in the summer of 2022. So we're talking 60 years or thereabouts ago. Optimism, an expanding economy, the beginnings of color television, the beginnings of the jet plane, all the kind of swinging stars of that period, you know, Carnaby Street, the Beatles, Bieber, Mary Quant, David Bailey, and so on. Very exciting period. And this new university was going to be the first of a whole bunch of them, with money coming from various sources, including government. Governments were concerned with contributing towards culture, education, arts council, and so on. And we found at Sussex, we were beginning to get huge numbers of applicants, people who wanted to be students, undergraduates at the University of Sussex, virtually equal numbers of young men and young women, which was unheard of at Oxford or Cambridge. Many of the young women, the girls who applied to be students at Sussex, were the sisters of younger sisters, perhaps of clever older boys who'd gone to Oxbridge. And many of them were from very well-known families. Macmillan, the prime minister until 62 or 3 or whatever it was, his home secretary, I remember Henry Brooke, sent his daughter to the University of Sussex. Virginia Wade, the brilliant young tennis player, was an undergraduate at Sussex. Douglas Jay, member of the cabinet later on, sent his beautiful twin daughters, the Jay twins. And the Jay twins, I remember teaching them tutorials. I was teaching American studies. And they would sit, they would write essays, I would grade them and so on, just like everybody else. The whole teaching system, the whole tutorial system was really very revolutionary. It tried, in some ways, people talked about Sussex as being Balliol by the sea, Balliol, College Oxford. Many of the leading figures at Sussex, the creative figures, like Asa Briggs, who had, as an undergraduate, studied at Cambridge and did an LSE degree and so on, but later on became a big figure in Worcester College, Oxford. John Fulton, later Lord Fulton, the Vice Chancellor of Sussex, many of them had actually been lecturers, professors, whatever, at Oxford colleges or Cambridge in some cases. And the whole teaching here was partly Oxford-based. There were tutorials, individual tutorials, or maybe in my case by then, at that point, I would have 2 students only, and myself, and they would each have written an essay, which I would have supervised. I'd have given the bibliography. They'd have handed it in early so I could read it, or they'd read it to the other student and myself, and then we'd discuss it. My job was to be critical in the positive, hopeful sense. So there's an element of Oxford to that, hence the joke, Balliol by the sea. There's an element of America to it. I had just been in the United States. One of the reasons I think they wanted me to be there was my new minimal expertise in things American. I'd studied the whole American political history, the presidency, presidential decision-making, the Constitution, the role of the Supreme Court, the legislature, the federalism, which Europe was beginning to talk about also at around that time, and the idea, above all, of having not just a single subject like I did as an undergraduate. I studied, or I read, history, but by now there were major subjects and minor subjects. And the great thing about Sussex, to use Asa Briggs's phrase, was they wanted to redraw the map of learning so that it was cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-cultural. if you were reading history, or if you're reading chemistry, or physics, or economics. It wasn't simply a subject and you had to research that and nothing else. Everything, including the subjects I've just mentioned, are touching on wider varieties of expertise. And my job was to be part of a university that wanted to be cross-disciplinary. History wasn't just kings and queens and the papacy and the crusades and military and politics. It also included, why not, personal relationships, diet, clothing, attitudes towards religion, attitudes to those whose religion you disagreed with, the history of the way education has been taught, if that's not putting too much of it. But there was also, and I so admired the great founding fathers of Sussex, Fulton, Aserbrigg, David Daches, and others, all of whom I'll talk about it a bit more in a moment, that they also encouraged relaxation, social events, cultural events, artistic events. You often, there was I, a lad in his mid-20s, and I'd walk around the lovely grounds of Sussex with the buildings going up, and I would see a rather gorgeous young couple on the hills there, and I'm not quite sure what they were doing, but they might well have been reading the same book together and sharing views about it. It looked very sexy, and partly it doubtly was. Remember the sexy 60s? That's when the pill was invented. The grounds near some of the buildings, the library and so on, might very well on a nice sunny day be packed with attractive youngsters simply enjoying a little rest after they had probably lectures and tutorials all morning, an essay they had to do over the course of the next week, lunch together, and they just wanted to sort of relax or go for a little walk. Why not? It was that kind of place. It got a huge amount of publicity, I might say, massive promotion in all the serious papers about the educational system, but also fashion magazines. I mean, the J Twins, I mentioned the J Twins before. And as I say, their father and their brother, who became a distinguished figure in the political world, but they were perfectly prepared. And why not? To be photographed for a fashion magazine, Illustrated London News, whatever it was, with the University of Sussex there in the background. I mentioned the buildings of Sussex. They were, as I say, by no means all completed when I turned up originally in 63, autumn 63. And they were going up, and the arts building that I had my office in, this was completed, as were other buildings. I mentioned Falmer House and so on. And one day, I remember we had a lovely visit from Basil Spence, the architect, Sir Basil Spence. Now, he was already famous by then. He contributed to the Festival of Britain in 1951 on the South Bank. And most recently, he was the architect who had been appointed to update, complete, rebuild the Coventry Cathedral, which had been horrendously bombed by the Nazi bombings during the war, during the Blitz. And Basil Spence was then, of course, why not? He was the top architect in the country, invited to design all the campus, all the buildings for the new University of Sussex. And he came along and spoke to us one day. He was actually a much gentler, nicer, jollier fellow than you see in that particular photograph. And he would explain to us, I remember so well, we said, well, the University of Sussex isn't a bit like Coventry Cathedral. What are your guiding principles? And he would tell us that many of Sussex has had a lot more buildings since I was there. My daughter was there as a student long after I had left, around the turn of the century. But he would say how much he had been influenced by ancient Roman buildings in the Forum, or the Renaissance Italian, sort of Mediterranean architecture more generally. Many of the Sussex buildings, they were kind of low brick constructions with curves and their own courtyard or fountain or whatever it might be, very often linked by long open walkways, because this was an open rural area, and very much influenced, as he said, by Mediterranean architecture, essentially. And you can see that in some of the buildings. I mean, this was an early stage. You see it at a later stage there. A great many curves, long walkways, huge views of the outer, lovely Sussex hilly countryside. And, you know, when he mentioned the influence of ancient Rome, you only have to think of the Colosseum in ancient Rome, which many of you, I'm sure, will have visited. Think of the gradual building of the meeting house. In fact, you have a photo there of it actually being built. And there's a kind of rotundity or roundity, or whatever the word would be, which very much on a local scale, a smaller scale, the curvature of the famous Roman Colosseum. I also remember looking for links with Coventry. I don't know whether you've been to Coventry Cathedral. I mean, most brilliantly creative building, where instead of pulling down the remains of the original St. Michael's Cathedral, what Spence did was to build a new modernist, modern-minded, Bauhaus-y kind of modern cathedral, and link the two to suggest the old and the new in a very brilliant way. And they're practical similarities. As you go into Coventry Cathedral, immediately, particularly on a nice sunny day, you'll be drenched by a window full of every kind of colored glass, like in a traditional cathedral, but very, very differently done. And you get very much the same when he opened the Meeting House of Sussex. There's the John Piper window from Coventry Cathedral, and there is the Meeting House at University of Sussex. I mentioned it's very good to meet the architect of I never met any of the architects of my old college at Cambridge. They've been dead about 500 years. But it was good to meet Spence and to know that every aspect of the new University of Sussex, the approach to learning, the social life, the buildings, the cross-disciplinarity, every aspect they were aiming at the highest available possible source. And that included the architecture of the campus itself. There's a picture of John Fulton, previously, I think, a professor of philosophy, I think, at Oxford, I think actually at Balliol, hence Balliol by the Sea. Same is true of the senior tutor, Patrick Corbett, who was there when I was there. Asa Briggs, I mentioned his career at Worcester College, Oxford, both before Sussex and indeed after Sussex, where he became by which time he'd had a peerage, and he became the provost of Worcester College many years later. So in so many ways, the university encompassed the American cross-disciplinarity, the Oxford tutorialism, the link between study and the fullness of life, the food you ate, the people you met, the opportunities you were given to travel, to become cultural, to become artistic, and so on. And I really relished all that. And the principal figure of all, to me, of course, was Asa Briggs, Lord Briggs. I knew a little bit about it. Let me say a few words about him. And I don't want to give you his whole biography. By the way, I'm the man who wrote the obit to dear Asa just a few years ago in 2016. And you can't write a short obituary of such a varied, talented man. I loved him. He's very good to me. A few little things about him. Yes, he was the great reviver, along with Nicolaus Pevsner and John Betschman and one or two others, of Victorianism. When I was a kid, I knew that everything Victorian, was rubbish. Who'd ever build a concert hall like the Royal Albert Hall now with that awful acoustic and so on? Who'd ever build, St. Pancras Station nowadays? We want modernism. But Asa and the people I mentioned, he wrote books on Victorian people, Victorian things, Victorian cities, and so on. And he continued as the head of the School of Studies, which included historians like me, to lecture whenever he wasn't rushing off doing 1,000 other things. He was on the board of this, a governor of that. He was on the advisory board to Glyndebourne Opera, for example, nearby, near Lewes, where Asa was living, near Sussex. And I remember because of that, I was able to make my first, I've always been a great opera lover. I've written books on the social, cultural history of opera. And I remember because of Asa, I was able to make visits to Glyndebourne with, one or two other of my fellows to dress rehearsals, free, of course. And I remember in 1965, they were putting on Dido and Aeneas by Purcell. And the woman playing Dido, who's got this famous aria, remember me and all that, was some young English singer. I thought, lovely voice, acts well, gorgeous, but she'll never make it, sadly, because she's got the most unmemorable name, some stupid name. Her name was Janet Baker. And of course, Janet Baker went on to be one of the great, great singers in British English musical history as singer of both opera and songs. And so far as I know, is still with us and approaching something like 90. I owe that to Asa. I owe the fact that Chichester Theatre, which I revisited just the other day, oddly enough, it was acting as a future for a possible national theatre in London. And Laurence Olivier was in charge of it at that time. And again, because I was at Sussex and Asa knew everybody and everything, several of us were able to visit this new festival theatre at Chichester and see several shows with, Olivier directing or acting, some young man called Jacoby, I think Maggie Smith and others, all in the early mid-60s. And we'd sort of drive over there and enjoyed cultural life in general, in so many different ways. Asa's office was just up the corridor from mine, so I saw a lot of him. And every now and then his secretary would pop in and say, "Oh, Daniel, Asa was just asking whether you've got a copy of a book by so-and-so, or do you remember when so-and-so, because he's got some lecture he's got to give this afternoon or a speech he's given tonight or something." And I remember one day, we're talking mid-60s, of course, she popped in and said, "Oh, Daniel, sorry to bother you. You're an Americanist. Do you know the author James Baldwin?" I said, "Absolutely, James Baldwin, major, creative, Black American, one of the finest writers there is." "Well, you don't happen to have any books by him, do you? Because Asa needs to read one." So I dug them out from my shelves, said, "Yeah, sure, he's welcome. Keep them as long as he likes, and let me have him back when he's done." That night, live on television, Asa Briggs was in London, appearing on some book show with James Baldwin alongside himself. And I remember, I couldn't believe it. He kept, in the course of discussion, in the most amiable fashion, like this picture, he said, "Oh, no, I realize what you're saying, Jimmy, but when you write a book about so-and-so, I wondered why you included this." He'd read both of these bloody books on the train down from Brighton to London. He was like that. He absorbed everything at great speed. He probably got home late that night and hand wrote the next chapter of his book. He was just beginning to work on what became a 5-volume history of the BBC. And later I went to work at the BBC and saw him on and off throughout his life. I must just tell you, he was always flying off somewhere. We used to joke and call him Lord Briggs of Heathrow. And, you know, if you actually want to see him, say, well, I'm about to take a taxi to Heathrow. Do you want to join me in the taxi? I'll make sure the university pays your journey back. Tiny word, and then I'll move on to some of the other people I knew there. When the time came, some years later, when I suddenly get a phone call from Lord Archie Gordon, who later becomes the Duke of somewhere in Scotland, can't quite remember. This is Archie Gordon. I believe you recently did a couple of broadcasts and you wrote an article for The Listener or New Society or something. Our talks and documentaries department needs someone. This was autumn 67. We need someone for 6 months into next year because there's obviously going to be quite a demanding American election next year. And you apparently you know about America. You were there not long ago. Would you be interested in the possibility of a job that we can offer you a 6-month contract because somebody is taking a sabbatical? And do let me know, and maybe we could come to London and we could meet and we could decide. And I was very excited, very flattered. I was always a bit more of a generalist than the kind of academic political scientist I probably should have been. So I went to Asa and said, well, Asa, hate to tell you this, but I've been offered the possibility of a 6-month job at the BBC, in which, of course, I'd concentrate on American politics and government and probably visit there. But I might, produce programs on other subjects that aren't really my special subject. I know somebody who's very expert on Chagall, for example, or the influence of Platonic philosophy on the philosophe or something. But it's not quite what I'm supposed to be doing here. What do you think? And Asa, bless him, he said, Daniel, I think you'd enjoy that. You're very versatile. You're always very curious to know about new things. But, you know, you've done a very good job here. You lecture well. They admire you and like you, and you've contributed to this, that, and the other. Why don't you try it? I know a number of people at the BBC. You know, if it works and they offer you a permanent job, fine. Good luck to you. If it doesn't, just give me a ring. And I'll be happy to open your job for you again here at Sussex. I mean, he couldn't have been more generous than that. And I really liked him. And it wasn't just that he was friendly. He also had a range of serious expertise, both intellectual and managerial, that was absolutely, in my experience, unprecedented. So he was the dean of one of the cross-cultural schools of study. They didn't have departments at Sussex or anything old-fashioned like that. And another dean of English and American studies, just along the same corridor, was David Daiches, D-A-I-C-H-E-S, Diachus, little Jewish boy that I was. I remember knowing that he came from the Diachus family, but by now he was David Daiches, lovely, genial fellow, very friendly, very warm, very engaged, again, very intellectual celebrity. He was always on, you know, the BBC Brains Trust and things like that. Both of these figures were very widely known beyond simply the academic world. And Daiches was also had plenty of time, always smoking his pipe, you know, to teach a seminar of some kind. There he is on the left, with a little group of people whom he's in charge of. And English and American studies, because David had been during the war working at the British Embassy in Washington, producing pamphlets for the British Information Service, very much as Isaiah Berlin had done, for example, being in the British Embassy in Washington during the war. And neither Asa nor David Daiches nor any of them chose to show off their expertise. They were engaging, approachable, friendly, brilliantly competent people whom it was a pleasure and a privilege to work for and to work under. So I was personally, officially an Americanist, having recently been in America for a couple of years, traveled all over it, got involved in civil rights, read a lot of novels, and had actually begun writing a book of my own, or thought about maybe I could. And being an Americanist, it was, again, not only the swinging 60s and the Beatles and the J Twins and all that, it was a period of enormous rise in Britain in interest in things American. The Americanization of British culture, beginning to use American language, being hugely influenced, and benefited enormously after the war from American financial donations. We began to talk about not only a film, but a movie, and talk about grassroots, or, touching base and all that kind of stuff. American, grassroots, American language, spelling, how do you spell inquiry or instill, and I found that many of my colleagues, even economists, physicists, literary experts, political scientists, there was a huge kind of admiration for America, love of America, people needing to go there. Remember, the jet plane was just being introduced. And they, about a year or two, I think, after I was appointed, they appointed a professor of American studies at Sussex. And the man that they appointed was Marcus Cunliffe. Now, Marcus Cunliffe, hugely competent, amiable man, like the best American historians, although he was British, but he crossed boundaries. He had written about Washington and the early development of American independence, the Constitution, Madison, the Federalist Papers. He knew all about that, but he also had written about modern American historiography, the ways in which recent times like Roosevelt, the New Deal, the war, and so on, were being rewritten by the latest historians, the introduction of a kind of statistical history to the study of the railroads in America and race issues and so on. Very, very versatile, a very engaging guy. And it was interesting that when Marcus came to Sussex, around that time, all these other new universities were developing American interests of one kind or another. University of East Anglia, by the way, another of the 7 new universities, they included on their faculty people like Malcolm Bradbury, who's a novelist as well as an expert on American literature, Chris Bigsby, broadcaster, writer, biographer of Arthur Miller, and so on. And so many of the new universities developed an interest in things American, as did the London fashion houses, the language we use, and so on, as I was mentioning. So Sussex embodied many aspects of the American academic system, the major subjects and the minor subjects and so on, all of which were incorporated into an Oxbridge tutorial system, and the cross-disciplinarity, which also included seeing British cultural life, history, economics in a broader European context. Remember that this is also the period of the development of the European coal and steel community that develops into the, eventually in the longer run, into the European Union. All of these things combined. Let me tell you briefly about one or two of the other colleagues of mine that I remember from those far off days. There were quite a number of distinguished women on the faculty when I was there. People like Marie Jahoda, Jahoda. She was a refugee. She was born in Vienna, the Vienna of Freud and Mahler and so on. She'd had to escape during the war, came to Britain during the war, went to America, came back, joined Sussex, and later became a very distinguished figure in the whole of social psychology. Think of cross-disciplinarity, social psychology, mass psychology. Another sociologist was Jenny Platt, who was a young new lecturer when I was there. There were other emigres from Central Europe. Tibor Barna, who's a distinguished economist, leading economist, born in Budapest, became, I don't know how Fulton and Asa and everybody, how they recruited the huge range of talent that they had at Sussex from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, America, French, German, all over the place. One of the friends I had there was Ranajit Guha, who was, his name suggests, came from India and was an expert on the history, the more recent history of the whole Indian subcontinent, which of course includes Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. Barry Supple, another basically economic historian who became actually in the longer run head of history. Roy Price, I mentioned the European connection. Roy Price was the progenitor of the whole idea of European studies at Sussex and got involved in what I learned to call development studies. I didn't know what that meant. What it meant was helping share the economics of the rich world with the poor world and help develop the poor world so that it would actually become a meaningful partner of the Northern Hemisphere. One of my dearest friends was a fellow Americanist. Some of you might remember. There's Murray Herder, whom I just mentioned, by the way, sorry, with Jenny Platt there on the right. Rupert Wilkinson, my fellow Americanist. He and I worked closely together under Marcus Cunliffe. Rupert, who remained a very, very close friend till his death not very long ago, he was very expert in writing and lecturing about the American personality, the American character, landing, with your feet busy running while you're moving, attitudes to the future, to each other, American optimism, the pursuit of a traditional, it'll all be all right in the end, it'll all be great, and I'm going to be part of it, American optimism of that time, which was very important. And towards the end of his life, I can't remember, but I think he knew he didn't have long to go. He wrote the most moving book, autobiographical, about his childhood. His parents were in the Far East, and he was imprisoned by the Japanese, I think in the Philippines, during the war, and survived, and wrote it all up in a very, very moving autobiographical book, which is also about character. And I must say, I miss him very much. He was a dear friend, and we, as I say, remained very friendly to the end. I was recently emailing his widow, Mary, telling her that I was going to be talking about him in this talk about the great, great old days at Sussex. Rod Kedwood, many of you will know or would have known or even continued to know over time, expert in European studies and in particular recent French history, and in particular those who were brave enough to join the resistance, the French resistance during the war, many of whom Rod was able to interview in French because they were still alive when he was working on that project, and very few would be to this day now. I suppose the person I've remained to this day closest to, and is indeed still alive, is the amazing Peter Burke. Peter Burke was at Sussex for many years and developed into one of the world's leading cultural historians. Cultural history, the history of conversation, humor, knowledge, What do we mean by cultural history? The huge range that he was one of the few people who was one of the entrepreneurs leading us away from history from the top down, as it used to be, history from the bottom up, much more the social history of the 60s and 70s and so on, to a kind of multicultural history. When I was a kid, culture meant the arts, art, architecture, music, novels, poetry, theatre, etc. Cultural history came to mean attitudes of all kinds, values, body language, religion, how you dressed, the clothing you wore, what you were interested in, what you thought was disgusting and shouldn't be talked about, what other periods thought you shouldn't talk about, but now you can, or the opposite. When I saw Peter Burt most recently for lunch just a few months ago, he's well into his 80s. I'm only, doesn't matter what I am, I was born in 38. But Peter told me he's now working on a book on the history of ignorance. And I'm sure when the time comes, it'll be brilliant. He's absolutely not a show-off of any kind, gentle, quiet, thoughtful, modest, highly intelligent man. For his wife was originally from Brazil, so he speaks and reads not just Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, every imaginable language. He always used to joke, probably still does. You know, the first 7 languages are the most difficult. And I owe him so much. He was at one point writing a book, a comparative book about trade in late Renaissance Venice and Amsterdam for a publisher who wanted comparative history. And it was a result of that and Peter's recommendation that one of my books was on the attitudes and values, the cultural history, comparing British and American values. So Peter is one of the many people who luckily is still with us, and I still see him every now and then, and we're in touch, from whom I have learned so much, and who is a greatly, greatly valued, dear friend from the Sussex days. Then he went on and became Professor of Cultural History at Cambridge at Emmanuel College, and he's to this day the emeritus prof of cultural history at Cambridge, based on at Emma. Some of you will remember Hugh Carney, another historian, very, very versatile. You probably know or have occasionally heard his daughter, who presents the Today Show a great deal, Martha Carney, a lot of BBC Radio Current Affairs programs. Hugh himself, I think, died not so very long ago, and he was very much, very, very versatile, interested in 17th century history, Puritanism, Irish history, Yeats, Joyce, and so on. Lovely colleague who had an office a door or two away from me. Larry Lerner, Lawrence Lerner, Larry Lerner, another hugely versatile. I mean, he wrote novels and poems and so on, but he also wrote literary criticism. He engaged, he lectured, he spoke to students, just the sort of person whom you could hardly fail to get on with. And indeed, many of the people I've mentioned, and many another I haven't mentioned and probably should, when I did move on to the BBC later on, I was very happy to engage so many of them in some of the programs that I was able to produce. And indeed, Aza, above all, had many Radio 3, Radio 4 programs, in which Aza was one of the consultants or a star, or in a bitter conversation with somebody who disagreed with him, right through, and saw him very often in the BBC, where he was, as I say, with various assistants, writing the 5-volume history of the British Broadcasting Corporation. John Roll, or Roll, we used to call him, he was, as you'll guess from his name, a Germanist, brilliant young historian, again, a very engaging colleague. And John was beginning to write that sequence of books, for which he became very famous and celebrated, on Germany, 19th century Germany, Prussian times, the Bismarck era, the Kaiser, late 19th century into the 20th century German political, social, economic history. And he's really left his mark whenever anybody wants to try and understand, simplistically, people say, oh, what brought about Nazism? Stupid, innocent question. Every nation in the late 19th century was reviving its own cultural national history. Sibelius in Finland, or Yeats in Ireland, or the revival of the whole King Arthur thing in Britain. Italian nationalism that developed into a united Italy, German nationalism that resulted in a united Germany in 1871. If you want to know the really deeper origins of early and mid 20th century Germany, read the books by the brilliant John Roll. I won't list them all, just look them up. Oh, there were so many colleagues. I remember being very friendly with Donald Winch, the economic historian, Michael Lipton, also very much involved in what I referred to before, development studies and so on. But let me gradually move you towards the end of all this. I haven't probably talked enough about my own life at Sussex, which I loved. I did my best. I worked hard. I left after just a few years because the BBC offered me a short-term job and then a long-term job. But I kept in touch with Sussex and so many of the people that I have just mentioned to you. In my own life, it was a swinging, exciting, dangerous time. I had at Cornell in the States developed a relationship with a young student, a girl, and we kept in touch. She eventually came over to England, to Sussex, where we lived together for a while, actually bought a house together in Kemp Town, fairly low cost house, but then my salary was very low. Well, it wasn't low, it was reasonable for a young lecturer in those days. I don't know, around £1,000 or something. And then we split up and all the rest of it. But I found myself, remember what I said to you before about getting actively involved in civil rights, actively involved in, practical, political, social problems in America, which I found abhorrent. I've been personally very lucky. I don't think I've ever suffered some kind of anti-Semitism. I'm not a practicing Jew at all, but was brought up in a Jewish family and remember the war and visited Nazi or post-Nazi Germany many, many times. I wanted to cross boundaries. I had a German girlfriend at one time. We once went to see Churchill when he came to Cambridge. I've always wanted to cross boundaries and be involved in the wider world. And when I was at Sussex, America, my beloved America, first of all, it had been destroyed in so many ways by the assassination of President Kennedy, which had a huge impact on me personally. I never realized how much I was identifying with him as a kind of role model. Succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, and I'd spent a whole summer in Texas, so I knew that world well. But by now, the Vietnam War was getting, in my humble opinion, worse and worse. And our Prime Minister now in Britain, since almost the time I settled in Sussex in '64, was Harold Wilson, a moderate, intelligent leader of a Labour government. And Harold Wilson, wanted to keep closely in touch with our American allies, the special relationship, NATO and all that. And you didn't want to offend our American cousins too much. And every now and then he'd go and visit Lyndon Johnson, and you see him in that photo kind of reflecting and wondering what Lyndon Johnson was really saying to him. But you had to be very, very careful. And at no point had Harold Wilson publicly said, I wish to disassociate ourselves in Britain from the appalling, increasing brutality of the war in Vietnam being conducted by our dear American friends, the Americans. And I'd been in the States and I'd seen anti-Vietnam demos, and I'd met people whose dad had been killed in Vietnam. I mean, it was a major, serious project. And it was decided, exactly like making Basil Spence the architect or getting this celeb or that celeb, that the Prime Minister, why not, who's helped develop the University of Sussex and the other new universities, should be given an honorary degree by the University of Sussex. This was 66, I think. And I was still rather a angry, active, young political activist. And I found myself wanting to draft a letter to the Prime Minister, the text of which I still have. I've reproduced all this, by the way, in my new book, my own memoir, the one I showed you at the beginning, called Just Passing Through. I felt my whole life has been just passing through from one thing to another, opening doors to things that I thought were shut to me. You know, if I was born a little Jewish boy, what's it like being a Catholic? If I've been born white, what's it like being black? I was forever, and still am in old age, questioning things. And I thought, why not ask the Prime Minister, ask a question. If you're getting an honorary degree at the University of Sussex in the Dome in Brighton, and you will be accompanied by other celebrities. Yehudi Menuhin was going to be there, and Robert Menzies, the recently retired Prime Minister of Australia, and the scientist Blackett, for example, Ralph Bunche, human rights activist, and a whole series of presidents of American universities. Talk about Sussex wanting to get goodwill and no doubt money from the United States. It was going to be an amazing, major public occasion, massively publicized. So I drafted this letter to Wilson: Dear Prime Minister, here at the University of Sussex, as in many parts of the country, there are many, many people who, without telling you what you need to say on this particular occasion, but would wish that somehow you would find it possible to, criticize the Americans for some of the things they're doing in Vietnam, or at least dissociate ourselves from it, or hope that between you might find a way of bringing all this horror and mass killing, a bit like Ukraine these days, to a halt. And I took it around my fellow Sussex faculty members, small fields, many of whom I didn't know, people particularly in some of the sciences or something. And something like, almost everybody I asked to sign it, signed it. Particularly, once you got my signature and half a dozen or a dozen more, or 25 or 30 or 40, more and more people said, oh, yeah, sure, okay, Daniel, I'll sign it. And we sent it off to the Prime Minister, registered, 10 Downing Street, blah, 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 signed by me. And I thought, I'll show a copy to the Brighton Evening Argus. Why shouldn't they see it as well? And of course they thought, oh, horrible, dangerous lefties at this university, which we're all supposed to support. And that put Asa Briggs in an interesting dilemma. He was very nice to me. He always respected me. He was honorable. And he said, and he didn't want to tell me I'd done anything wrong. We all believed in freedom of speech, didn't we? And I had exercised freedom of speech. So he said, Daniel, the Prime Minister's coming for an honorary degree, and I gather you've written to him about the Vietnam thing. You probably know that we've got lots of presidents of American universities turning up: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, this one, that one, Eisenhower's brother's in charge of one of them, Kingman, Brewster, and so on. We need somebody to look after them all. They need to be ferried around. They're all going by bus to the Vice Chancellor's house, Lord Fulton's house, for tea one day. There's a dinner and Menuhin and everybody going to be there, and indeed the occasion the next day at the Dome where the event happens. Would you like to be in charge of them all? You're young, you're energetic, you know about America. So A, I was very flattered. B, I was very thrilled, but a bit anxious. And C, I knew damn well why he was doing it. It was a way of keeping me silent. I promised, we're not going to boo the prime minister at the ceremony or shoot him or anything like that. So I had this double role in which I was the leading dangerous figure against Wilson and was also the person who was protecting, looking after, and accompanying all the visitors to this amazing occasion. So I was almost the only faculty member at the event itself, and Wilson, being very shrewd, acknowledged the presence of that letter he'd received, and he would give it due serious thought, and the whole thing went off without a problem. And indeed, one or two of the American presidents quietly said to me, are you the one who's written this letter? Oh, really? What do other people in Britain think? Do you think the Americans are doing the wrong thing in Vietnam? Is that a popular view? Tried to engage me in serious conversation about something that was absolutely critical at Sussex at that moment. And you can see the kind of thing the Evening Argus was. This was July 66. Angry Brighton councillors want to fine the university because it's a rebel, it's rebellious, lefty, dangerous. This is some years before all the student riots that happened everywhere. And the Prime Minister, and all these papers mentioned my name, so they all knew it was me doing all that. Interesting times, and I found the experience interesting, quite moving. I held my guns intellectually, but only metaphorical guns and verbal guns. And in due course, the Vietnam War did gradually diminish in its horror. And indeed, it was Nixon who presided over the end of it all. So I need to bring all this to an end, but more or less finished. But let me just tell you one other thing by way of conclusion. When I left Sussex, it was partly because I had been offered this possible job at the BBC, which I enjoyed, but I'd also been given a period off because I had been commissioned to write my first book. And that came about thanks to the beloved Marcus Cunliffe, my professor of American Studies at Sussex. One day, Marcus came into my office. This would have been about 66 something. Oh, Daniel, sorry to bother you. I was probably just preparing a lecture or something. Do you have a moment? Well, you've written quite a number of articles and people say they like them very much. And you've apparently done a few broadcasts about America. Well done. Would you be interested in the possibility of writing a book? And I thought, my God, I've never written a book. How am I up to it? Well, I'll tell you what it is, Daniel. There's a publisher, and they're wanting to do a series of books on the great powers in the world from the First World War to the present. If you think back, Russia and the revolution to the present and so on. China, the creation of the communists to the present. And maybe, Germany from then to the present. And they've asked me if I would write a book called, First World War to the present. I'm terribly busy at the moment because I've got a big commission involving a lot of research about George Washington, which I need to continue. It's comparing Washington and the British system at that time. Would you be interested in taking this on? And I don't want to bore you with the details of how I finally made up my mind, but I went to see the publishers, chatted, decided they wanted something that I probably could do. It would not be just a detailed political history, but a kind of broad social, economic, cultural history, which I could reinterpret on the basis of my personal experience and knowledge. So I did take that on. I was still not sure whether to stay at Sussex or to go to the BBC. I discussed all that with Asa several times. I thought I'll try out the BBC, but maybe just for 6 months and get my old job back at Sussex. Or maybe I would be right for the BBC, who can be sure? Anyway, I signed the contract, wrote the book, went through all the details with it, went to the publishers, and when I took it to them, I was ahead of the contractual date. And the publisher, lovely guy, said to me, "No, well done, Daniel. I mean, I've never known an academic get the manuscript of a book delivered ahead of the contractual deadline." So I said, "Well, I didn't want to be late. I didn't want to hold you up, He said, "If I may say so, Daniel, I think that proves that you're more appropriate for the BBC than for the academic world. In the BBC, everything's got to be absolutely the right length and dead on time. In the academic world, almost nothing is. So the very fact you brought it in, congratulations, we'll get the book out in very good time, and we'll get it out in time for it to be your 30th birthday present." And I told Asa, and he laughed and went on, and the book was indeed produced, The 20s to Vietnam, by the publishers Batsford. It then went into many editions, went into American editions, led to the book I mentioned earlier, comparing British and American attitudes and values, the thing that Peter Burke helped initiate. And the last time I went to Sussex, I've been there many times, I went there this century in 2014, photograph of me right in front of the Arts Building where I had my office. But this is only a few years ago, 2014. And I went there for the launch of the Miles Taylor, book by Miles Taylor, my boss then at the Institute of Historical Research. He'd put together an anthology of essays about Asa Briggs. Asa was there. We had a nice chat. He signed my copy of the book. And 2 years later, 2016, Asa died. We should have celebrated his centenary last year, 2021. I hope you did. I thought about it, miss him deeply, mention him a lot in my own autobiography, not only about Sussex, but about the time at the BBC, the programs he and I made together, programs about ends of centuries, which turned into a book that Asa and I jointly edited. And he embodied all that was best about Sussex, all that had influenced me then and ever since, about the passing through between one door and another and making your own mark, whether it's academic, whether it's as a historian, whether it's traveling to the Arctic and the Antarctic, or making radio programs about world economic development, or history, historiography, all of which I owe, much of which I owe to my time at Sussex. I mentioned the book in which I've incorporated a great deal of that, which I called Just Passing Through, which in a deeper sense we're all doing. Interactions with the world, 1938 till last year, right through to COVID. And I want to end by thanking you for inviting me to talk about my memories of Sussex. It meant so much to me. I mentioned that my daughter was a student there many years later. And recently, when this book came out, she gave it to her youngest child. And I've got a lovely photo with which I will end of my little grandson then, wondering whether he can be bothered to read through this very, very boring book. You have to make up your own minds about that. Anyway, thank you very, very much. I hope what I said didn't go on for too long and was of some interest. And it's been a great pleasure for me to try to remember my wonderful time at the wonderful University of Sussex. So thank you very much for having me.